Investigators reviewed the footage again and again and again. Hours of surveillance video streamed across the screen. People walking, cars passing, doors opening and closing. Nothing stood out. Nothing moved too fast. Nothing seemed suspicious. Nothing appeared wrong. But crimes aren't always revealed by movement. Sometimes, the truth exists for less than a second. And in this case, it wasn't a video that broke everything open. It was a single frame. One frozen moment, so brief that no one noticed it at first. And yet, hidden inside that one frame was the mistake that exposed the entire crime. The crime itself was quiet. No alarms. No screams reported. No forced entry. When police arrived, the scene was almost unsettling in how normal it appeared. Furniture undisturbed. Doors locked. Windows intact. The victim's routine suggested nothing out of the ordinary had happened that day. Friends described recent conversations as calm. Coworkers noticed no distress. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. Crimes like this are the hardest to solve, because chaos usually leaves clues. Order does not. Investigators initially suspected a medical emergency, then an accident. Only later did the possibility of foul play emerge, and by then, time had already begun to work against them. Surveillance cameras surrounded the area. Street cameras, building cameras, private security systems. At first, detectives were relieved. Cameras don't forget. Cameras don't lie. But cameras also don't explain themselves. Officers gathered hours of footage, dozens of angles, days of recordings. People entered buildings. Cars passed intersections. Lights turned on and off. Everything looked normal. And that's when the investigation stalled. Because when evidence exists but refuses to speak, doubt creeps in. Maybe the crime happened elsewhere. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. That assumption almost ended the case. Investigators watched the footage in real time, then again at double speed, then frame by frame. Nothing obvious appeared. No struggle. No suspicious interaction. No clear suspect. This is where many investigations quietly fail. When evidence exists but feels useless, detectives began narrowing timelines instead. When was the victim last seen alive? When was the last confirmed contact? What cameras overlapped those moments? That process eliminated hours of footage, then minutes, then seconds. And that's when one technician noticed something strange. Not movement, absence. At a specific timestamp, something didn't match. The camera angle was fixed, the lighting consistent, the environment unchanged. Except for one thing, a shadow that shouldn't exist. It appeared for less than a second, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. The technician paused the footage, rewound it, paused again. There it was. A shape, a reflection, a distortion that didn't belong. Most people would have missed it, but investigators didn't move on. They froze the frame. A single frame became everything. Zooming in revealed more than expected. The shape wasn't random. The reflection wasn't natural. It suggested movement that the camera didn't capture fully. A partial object, a glimpse of fabric, a reflection from a surface investigators hadn't considered. Suddenly, the footage wasn't empty anymore. It was incomplete. And incomplete evidence is dangerous, because it points somewhere. Detectives began mapping camera angles again. What surfaces could reflect that image? What paths aligned with that frame? Slowly, a new timeline emerged. Once investigators knew where to look, everything changed. Other cameras were revisited. Not for faces, not for movement, but for continuity. One camera showed nothing, but the next showed absence. Another showed a door that should have moved, but didn't. Small inconsistencies appeared, each one insignificant on its own. Together, undeniable. The suspect believed the cameras showed nothing. But cameras record more than actions. They record expectations. And expectations had been violated. The person of interest had passed multiple cameras. Casually. Confidently. No rush. No hesitation. But confidence creates patterns. And patterns can be broken. When investigators compared the suspect's statements with the reconstructed timeline, cracks appeared. Times didn't align. Distances didn't match. Movements didn't make sense. and all of it traced back to one frame. When questioned, the suspect remained calm, helpful, detailed, too detailed. They referenced moments they shouldn't remember clearly. They corrected investigators unnecessarily. And when shown still images, not video, something changed. A hesitation, a pause. That single frozen frame carried more weight than hours of footage, because it forced the suspect to confront what they believed was invisible. Most people think crimes are solved by dramatic evidence, confessions, weapons, witnesses, but reality is quieter. Crimes are broken by inconsistencies, by moments that don't belong. One frame doesn't prove guilt, but it reveals truth, and truth reshapes everything. The room stayed quiet longer than it needed to. No one celebrated, no one spoke, because what that frame revealed wasn't dramatic in the way movies teach us to expect. There was no raised weapon, no violent act frozen in time, just a detail so small it almost felt unfair that it carried so much weight. A shadow where there shouldn't have been one, a reflection that didn't match the angle, a movement that contradicted the story told so confidently, so often. It was the kind of truth that doesn't shout, it settles. The detectives didn't rush. They rewound, zoomed, compared. Then they checked everything else again. Phone records, access logs, witness timelines. One by one, the pieces quietly rearranged themselves around that single image, forming a shape the suspect never accounted for. And that's when the questions changed. Not what happened, but why this moment mattered so much. Because if this frame was wrong, then something else had to be wrong too. What the suspect didn't realize was that investigators weren't just looking at the footage anymore. They were looking at intent, at planning, at the possibility that what seemed spontaneous was anything but. That frame didn't close the case. It opened a door to actions taken earlier, to choices made long before the camera ever recorded that second, to evidence that hadn't even been reviewed yet. And somewhere buried in hours of overlooked data was something far more dangerous than a mistake, something deliberate, because the most unsettling part wasn't that the suspect was seen. It was that they thought this moment was invisible. And if they were wrong about that, what else did they believe no one would ever notice? Next time, we'll look at what investigators found when they followed that question.